If you were to buy a first Dungeons & Dragons Adventure starter pack, you'd receive a player's handbook, a set of dice, and most likely a Goblin Encounter. But even though they're one of the most basic monsters in all of D&D, they're also surprisingly one of the most versatile in their implementation. So whether it's your first campaign or your 50th, you can always have fun with these little rascals. Hello, my name is Matt, and welcome to My Hidden Nerdy Side, a channel created by a nerd who doesn't have many nerdy friends, and so I must rant to you. Today we are going to be tackling goblins, a creature I'd wager you find in roughly 50% of all D&D games. We're going to go over the basic lore, background info, and stats surrounding these shifty little buggers and build an encounter you can steal, modify, and plop directly into your Dungeons & Dragons game. This encounter in particular is one I've used in-game twice already, and both parties had very different approaches. So we'll talk about the different ways this encounter can play out as well. If you are well aware of the basic lore, background info, and mechanics behind goblins in D&D, then feel free to pop on over to the timestamp right here so you can jump straight to the encounter itself. I'll leave a clickable version in the description below. Also, if you like what I do here, stick around and subscribe, for I'll be putting out at least one of these videos every week and hopefully additional content the more this channel grows. Alright, let's take a quick look at goblins. Now, this section is going to be shorter than in other videos because their base set of actions is fairly simple, and even though their lore and background info is a good jumping off point, goblins usually just get flexed and twisted to suit any campaign role they need to fill, so going super in depth would just be a waste of time. So, according to page 165 in the Monster Manual, goblins are small, black-hearted, selfish humanoids that lair in caves, abandoned mines, despoiled dungeons, and other dismal settings. In almost any fantasy setting, goblins are depicted this way, so it isn't such a surprise, but again, in your game, you can make goblins as evil or as good as you like. They are part of the goblinoid family alongside bugbears and hobgoblins, and are mainly motivated by greed and malice. They're a simple meritocracy. The smartest and strongest rise to the top and everybody else follows. Each lair has a boss or chief, but there may be a king or queen that rules over many goblin lairs. Now, despite goblins being individually really weak, they are very good at defending their lairs. So it's common to find makeshift traps and alarms scattered throughout and around their lairs to deal with intruders. Goblins are also well known to raise and train rats as companions and wolves as rideable mounts, which is awesome. And finally, they worship the goblin god Malgul Biet, or something like that. I really don't know how to pronounce it. But he is the Mighty One, the Lord of the Depths and Darkness, said to be an 11-foot tall goblin with black skin and fire shooting out of his eyes. Goblins believe when they die, they join his army of dead goblins. However, this is not something they consider to be a privilege. In fact, they are terrified of him and his tyrannical ways, and so probably would have even more of a reason to want to keep on living than most. Looking at their stat block, their only really interesting trait is that they can hide and disengage as a bonus action every turn, which is great if you want your goblins to flee and warn others, or possibly deadly if you wanted to homebrew an evil goblin rogue NPC and get that sweet sneak attack. Other than that, they can shoot people with their short bows or hit them with their scimitars or spears or clubs or whatever simple weapon you want to give them. So, their moveset isn't the greatest, their lore isn't the most interesting, but somehow we keep seeing goblins pop up in tons and tons of official and homebrew campaigns. So what gives? Well, because they're some of the best creatures to toss at a low-level adventuring party, even if you're playing with a group who has little to no experience playing with each other. You can make them as simple or as difficult to defeat as you want while still staying true to the creature. You can run into a small group of them raiding a temple for gold and make short work of them. You can make them have an elaborate set of traps throughout an old mine and trash higher level parties. You can make them the goons of powerful aberrations. The sky's the limit. I also think because they have no real special abilities but aren't completely mindless monsters, it forces DMs to get creative with their goblins, which has made for some amazing and unique experiences. And because of this, even though everyone has a decent idea of what goblins are like going into a campaign, they always have the ability to surprise your players. And due to their low HP, your players will feel powerful and awesome taking them out with a single swing of their sword or a ray of magic from their fingertips. Trust me. Okay, so now that we've gone over the basic info and reasons to use goblins in your game, let's start crafting the encounter. This encounter will be aimed at parties level 2 to 5 depending on how difficult you want to make it, and it will be a short and lighthearted one that shouldn't last more than 1 or 2 sessions. The motivation for your party should be whatever makes sense for your campaign. But when I used this in game, they needed border passes in order to cross the border from the human province to the elven province in my homebrew world. And to do that, they needed to get someone with decent political standing to grant them one. So, if they talk to a nearby town mayor, he will issue them one if they put a stop to the string of recent goblin attacks. So, in short, someone in power has something the party wants or needs, and they will receive it once the goblin problem is dealt with. So, let's set the scene. Your party is traveling down the path to the town of Northbury, or whichever town name you choose, when they hear a woman screaming in the forest. If your party goes in, they'll see a young blonde human woman being dragged by her arms and legs by 4 goblins. Your party should be able to kill 1 or 2 of them fairly quickly, and then the others will flee in terror. Upon saving her, she will be very grateful and tell the party her name is Mercy and she's the daughter of the town's mayor. She was in her garden minding her own business when her friend called out to her to come inside for refreshments. This is when the goblins jumped out of the bushes and started dragging her away. She will tell the party that there have always been goblins deep in the forest, but as long as you don't go into their territory, they usually leave you alone. However, recently there has been more and more goblin attacks that happen closer and closer to Northbury. First, her boyfriend Alanis was kidnapped, then one of the mercenaries guarding the town was attacked, and now Mercy makes the 3rd attack in 1 week. So of course they can go straight to the goblin camp first and just bum rush in, but most of the time your party is going to want to find out more information or at least confirm the town mayor will actually give them what they want if they stop the goblin attacks. When your party heads into town to talk to the mayor, he will agree to give them the border pass in exchange for stopping the goblin attacks. It's important to note that he does not specifically say eliminate all the goblins, but just to stop whatever the reason is they're attacking. This distinction allows the party to take many different avenues down the line when it comes to handling the upcoming problem. The mayor will then point the party in the right direction they need to go, which is deep in the forest until they reach a huge cliff. The goblin camp is built up against it. This is the configuration I went with, but again, feel free to make it your own. Now, there are 2 other things your party could do that come to mind. They can question the mercenary who was attacked, and they could search the boyfriend's house. Upon questioning the mercenary, the party will discover 2 things. 1, the town doesn't have a town guard, but is guarded by a hired mercenary company. This seems like filler information, but it's important for some payoff later. Secondly, he'll tell you that he was patrolling the border of the town when a group of 3 goblins jumped out. They didn't attack right away, but they kept yelling mercenary at him, over and over again, seemingly like it was a question. They began to approach the mercenary, and so he attacked. He killed a goblin and then was injured, and the other goblins ran away when more mercenaries showed up. That's all your party will get out of him. If they go to Alanis' house and do some proper investigation, they can find he has a book of beginner's magic spells containing nothing over a 1st level slot. Alright, if your party does all of this, they now know there have been 3 victims. Alanis was the first and was kidnapped. The mercenary was the second and a fight broke out, but the mercenary was the one who attacked first. The third was Mercy, who was swarmed after her friend called out her name and would have been kidnapped if you didn't save her. They also know the goblins seem to be interested in mercenaries, and Alanis has a beginner's book of magic spells. Okay, so it's time to investigate some goblins. How many traps you want to set up before they get to the camp is up to you. I personally kept the number of traps I used to a minimum because I wanted to focus more around the camp itself. But if you and your players are really into the survival and tracking aspect of the game, then go wild. Toss in some swinging logs, tripwires, pitfalls, and whatever other insanity you want. However, just make sure you don't go overboard because A, they're low leveled, and B, we want them to make it to the camp eventually. So once the party gets past the traps and the goblin scouts patrolling the area, they will reach the camp. It has decently fortified wooden walls and it's up against a large rocky cliff face. Now I've ran this encounter twice already, and this is the moment where the approach they took changed drastically. One party literally ran through the front gate and started going ham. They ran into 25 goblins, a goblin chief, a goblin mage, and 4 wolves they have been training. It almost resulted in a TPK, and honestly, it probably should have if I wasn't DMing a brand new group and feeling merciful that day. But let's say they do some recon beforehand, like climb a tree to get the lay of the land or something like that. They can discover the goblin numbers beforehand and notice something odd. Out of one of the goblin huts will arise a humanoid figure in a red robe that is much too tall to be a goblin. He will ask if the mercenaries he asked for were brought to him, for his god demands it. I made his deity Ignata, the homebrew fire goddess in my world. I think any god that has a connection with fire works best for this encounter, and you'll see why later, but it is possible to workshop any god into the mix if you so choose. Now at this point, this encounter can go so many different ways, which makes it so fun. Your party can run in and kill everything and ask questions later. They could try and create a landslide using the cliff face to do lots of the work for them. They could come to the conclusion that the red-robed one is the reason behind all the attacks since he's the one asking for people to be brought to him and just kill him and skedaddle. They could also attempt to negotiate, and they could also do, well, a number of things. I told you what one of my parties did, but now it's time I tell you what the other one did. The other party sent in their barbarian, and he claimed he is a mercenary and let himself be captured. The goblins invited him into the camp, and the man in the red robe invited the barbarian into his tent. Once they were alone, he took off his hood and revealed that he is actually Alanis, Mercy's boyfriend that was the first to be kidnapped, and begged the barbarian to save him. He will then explain one day he was too far into the forest picking flowers for Mercy and was kidnapped by goblins. They tied him up and were going to cook him alive, so he tried to use magic to scare them away. He started using prestidigitation to snuff out and light torches and campfires, saying the fire goddess would punish them for their crimes if they didn't let him go. At this point, the Goblin Mage, who is a follower of Ignata and wants to be the chief of the Goblin camp, used this opportunity to use Alanis as a tool to raise his status amongst the goblins, claiming Alanis is the god's chosen and was sent as a reward to the Goblin Mage for his loyalty. Alanis will tell you that the camp is now split between those who follow the Goblin Mage and those who follow the Goblin Chief, and the Goblin Mage knows Alanis is a fraud but won't let him leave since he is the key to the Goblin Mage's social status. Because of this, Alanis convinced the Goblin Mage that one way the mage can solidify his power is to offer strong sacrifices to Ignata in front of the other goblins. Alanis suggested that he gather some mercenaries in Northbury to use as these sacrifices. However, what Alanis was really planning was to build his own mini mercenary army to help break him out of the goblin camp. This is why the goblins kept asking for mercenaries. If the party asks why the goblins tried to kidnap Mercy, after a little while he can help the party come to the conclusion that when Mercy's friend called out for mercy, the goblins heard this and thought she said mercenary. So essentially, this guy used prestidigitation to become a tool of a goblin mage and almost got his girlfriend kidnapped while trying to build a mercenary army to save him from goblins, who only kidnapped him because he went too far into their territory, something everyone in town knows you shouldn't do. If that's not a wacky-ass beginning quest line for your party to mull over, I don't know what is. At this point, what your party chooses to do is totally up in the air. If your party is able to piece all this additional information together before combat begins, all the previous options are still valid and a whole slew of others are now as well. The entire party could pose as mercenaries and Assassin's Creed style kill the goblins one by one inside the camp to get more of an advantage. They could align themselves with either the Goblin Chief or the Goblin Mage in exchange for Alanis. They could try and sneak Alanis out at night, or God knows what else they come up with. But this is why I love this encounter as one of the first encounters a party can run into, especially if it's a group that isn't used to playing with each other. There is always more information to find out. There is an endless number of ways it could play out. Creativity and absurdity is not only welcomed but encouraged, and it can become even wilder with further customizations. On top of that, it's also a terrific encounter to use as a DM to gauge the type of party you have on your hands and how you want to craft future encounters. If you discover your party is the run in and kill everything type and don't ask questions, then maybe you'll want to be careful making your future quests too investigation based. If your party goes the whole 9 yards and investigates every nook and cranny and uses their brains to successfully infiltrate the goblin base and avoid combat until it's absolutely necessary, then maybe you'll want to plan out multiple avenues and future encounters that your players can take that don't involve combat. So, this encounter is already quite in-depth and full of possibilities, but what are some ways you can spice it up and make it your own? Well, you could change up the environment. Instead of having it in a forest, you can make them a goblin tribe in the snowy mountains, for example, and let your party cause an avalanche or fight snowy monsters alongside the goblins. You could create another powerful figure or two within the goblin camp and have a full-on political battle between the 4 factions. If you want to use this encounter with a higher level party, you can beef up the difficulty by setting up the goblins with more powerful weapons and contraptions to use against the party. Heck, you can go as far as giving them a steampunk-like tank or something like that because why not? That sounds awesome. Maybe Alanis is actually loving his time with the goblins, and so you make him try to take control of the camp. However, I personally went with the route of making him a poor novice mage who doesn't really know how to control his magic. And so when he tried to cast a spell, I would roll a d20 to see if he would hit his target and even potentially hit a PC by accident. These are just some of the customizations I can think of off the top of my head, but as long as the intention behind them is fun, anything you can think of can work. But, of course, these are just some of the ways you can use goblins in your Dungeons & Dragons games. There are tons of different ways to take this encounter and spice it up, so please let me know what you would do in the comment section below so I can nerd out over them and smack myself in the head for not thinking of it. I'm going to be putting out at least one of these videos a week, so feel free to subscribe and share this video around if you liked it, and stay tuned for upcoming content. Thanks for watching and indulging my hidden nerdy side.